So one of the biggest and most impactful changes coming with the second Diablo 4 expansion is going to be the massive overhaul to skill trees. And this is not only going to change how we actually use the skill trees and the amount of customization we get out of them, but it's also going to massively change the overall balancing of the game. And with the most recent Diablo 4 showcase and then a Q&A after that, we've actually gotten quite a lot of new information on these skill trees where we basically know exactly how they're going to be working. And pretty much the only thing we have left to learn about these skill trees is all of the specific upgrades to our skills. And these new overhaul skill trees are actually going to be quite a bit different than the ones we have now. One of the biggest changes being all passives being removed from the skill trees. And that also includes our capstone passives, which have been pretty integral to a lot of builds and more specifically have been pretty integral to your overall power because most of them have been buffed over time and a lot of them just gave massive multiplicative damage increases. All passives in the skill tree are now removed. The only things within the skill tree now are the skills and the upgrades for those skills, and this also includes ultimates. As you go through and just look at the skill tree visually, the ultimates are also going to have the same amount of customization and upgrade options as all of the other skills. And I think that's actually pretty important because I think a lot of ultimates for a lot of classes and builds have been pretty weak, primarily because they don't have the upgrade options that other skills have. But now we're going to have a bunch of different upgrades and variants to those ultimates that are probably going to make them much more worthwhile and much stronger and more usable in a lot more builds, which I think could pretty heavily change how builds are created in general. Hopefully these ultimates feel ultimate, which has not been a thing for a lot of Diablo 4's history. And one of the starting things you'll notice is you can put a lot more points into every single skill itself. Right now in the live game, you can put 5 points into a skill. Then other things in the game like gear or runes can give you plus to skill ranks to get above that for additional scaling. But now in these skill trees, you'll be able to put 12 points into every skill. Now during the Q&A, they did say this isn't necessarily a finalized number, but presumably it's going to be like 10 or more points you can put into every skill, which at a baseline will just give a lot more scaling. It will also just allow you to put more points into the skills you're actually trying to use. And because there are no passives, this is actually going to be a much bigger part of where you're putting your skill points, because in builds right now, a lot of skills you're putting points into and using in your build, you don't actually have a lot of additional points into. You usually put more points into like 1 or 2 skills, and then all the other ones have like 1 point. And presumably because of this, they are going to change how this scales the skills, because usually putting more points would increase the damage, which is usually like a multiplicative increase, or reduce the cooldown of cooldown skills as well. And presumably they're going to do different things. I'm very curious if they are going to add the feature that we have in ultimates right now, where if you put 5 points into an ultimate right now, it gives you an additional effect. They didn't mention that during this, but that's still a possibility. We also don't know if that's still going to be a thing on ultimate skills. Presumably if you're still putting 12 points in the ultimates, they're either removing it or changing it how it works. So maybe it's just ultimates that get more effects when you put more points into them, or maybe none of the skills have them now. And also keep in mind, we will be having 10 additional levels when this expansion releases, and it seems that you'll have a total of 83 points based on the footage of the most recent showcase, so that's quite a lot of points. You will obviously be using more points into the upgrades and the variants, but it seems like a majority of those points are going to be used on skill upgrades and pretty heavily investing into skills that you want. Now, the biggest change coming to these skill trees and the things that these overhauls are going to be based around is the new upgrades and variants to all of our skills. So right now in the live game, you choose your skill, then you have 1 upgrade you choose. That's pretty much a free upgrade. You don't have any choices. Then you choose between 1 of 2 other upgrades. And most of the upgrades in the skill tree right now for skills are pretty basic. They're usually just like stat increases or different utility things. They're usually not gameplay changing. But in these new skill tree overhauls, they're adding 3 upgrade paths. There's 2 side paths that give you 1 of 2 options that are circular upgrades, meaning they're more passive. They do seem to have things that will be kind of gameplay changing, like duration increases, attack speed increases, but they generally seem to be more kind of power throughput increases or utility things for that skill. And that already gives you more options than we had in the previous skill trees, because it's 2 different choices skills with 2 different options apiece. And then finally, the middle section is what's going to be very important, and these are the variants. So you can choose between one of 3 or up to 4 skill variants. We've seen one skill with 4. We don't know if skills are going to be able to have more than 4 variants, and we don't know if a lot more skills are going to be getting than 3 variants. We do know that if you buy the expansion, you will have quite a bit more skill variants than people that don't. So some of your skills may have 4 options here, but the skill variants are much more substantial upgrades and changes to how the skills work. They did show off some examples like Hammer the Ancients for Barbarian that it did look like they got, I think, one of the unique powers from one of their unique specifically that kind of change how the skill works. I think one of them did an AoE around you instead of just being like an AoE smash in front of you. And previously in the first gameplay trailer of the expansion, we got to take a look at ball lightning from a sorcerer, where instead of shooting just ball lightnings in front of you, they then changed it to a fireball lightning, where they place these big balls of fire on the ground wherever they wanted to place them. So that significantly changed up how the skill actually worked and changed up its element, meaning it can pretty heavily scale with a lot of different things throughout the game and could potentially completely change a ball lightning build depending on what variant you're using. We also got to look at the Hydra skill from the sorcerer during the showcase, where they showed a few different options. Like one of them can make the Hydra burn everything in the area. One of them can make anything hit by the Hydra explode when they die. And then one of them they showed just turn the Hydra into a frost Hydra or an ice Hydra, which completely changes up the Hydra's element and will completely change up your build focused around that, because sorcerers have a bunch of different things that could work with that frost Hydra instead of the fire Hydra, so that could completely change up how the build actually works. And this seems to be the case with a lot of other skills. The variants themselves are supposed to change how the skill works in some way. So changes how the attack works, changes the area effect. Instead of maybe being a small attack in one area, maybe it's now a big AoE around you. Instead of being this element, it'll change to a different element. So the variance of these different skills is really supposed to be where these skills change pretty heavily. And that pretty much is all of the information we have on the skill trees. I don't think we're going to be getting anything really else because we kind of know how these work at this point. But I did want to mention that these are kind of your base customization in Diablo 4. You're going to be pretty heavily changing up your skills based upon these upgrades you're getting. You're going to be putting more and more points into these skills, which is going to have a pretty big impact, especially when you're leveling up. But in a broader sense, skill trees are having a lot of your overall power being taken out of them. Now they're much more focused on gameplay customization, and a lot of your power is going to be coming from other systems, but there's also going to be pretty massive gameplay impacting things from other features. More specifically, the talisman I went over in my previous video is going to allow you to have pretty massive changes, and the developers did give us a reveal that one of the talisman set items for the druid specifically changes your wolf companion skill into werebear companions, which could completely change how that skill really works, and more specifically completely change its scaling, and is a big visual change. So not only are we going to have pretty massive changes to the skill tree, allowing us to completely change our playstyles, but with a lot of the other systems in the game, you're going to have a lot of other customization, not just power increases, but also pretty heavily changing your build. So you can look at this skill tree overhaul as really the first line of massive changes coming with the expansion. This is going to be the first thing you're doing when you're leveling up. It's going to give you a lot more options. It's going to keep people on a lot more even playing field, because your big gameplay options, a lot of the things you would usually get from aspects, are now coming from the skill tree. As you keep progressing and get into the end game, you'll just be layering a bunch of different gameplay changes and options on top of those skill trees. So I think the expansion as a whole is going to be pretty massive for creating builds and changing all the builds we currently have, and this skill tree overhaul is really the first layer of that. But overall, I think this is significantly better than the skill trees we have right now. Realistically, you don't have a lot of gameplay altering things in the skill trees right now. The upgrades to all the skills are really just like stat increases or utility increases. These new skill trees are just going to allow you to completely change how skills work, which I think is going to be much better for leveling and much better as a baseline for then stacking things on top of it to create your actual build. This is definitely a massive improvement to the game as a whole. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.